4 months after I buried my husband. Inside was an emergency petition for temporary guardianship of my 5-year-old son. I was, and I'm quoting the document exactly, or suffering from a severe episode that renders her incapable of. For the minor child, as it turned out, neither had anyone else, because he didn't exist, and the one detail she forgot to check before she tried. I'm 31. My husband Daniel died in a safety harness failure that the county is still, though I've mostly stopped waiting for answers from that end of things. We had a son together, Ethan, and who is, without question, Daniel and I met in college, and built our life together the slow, a kid, a mortgage, the whole thing. Whether she was ever really part of it in the way that mattered is something. Patricia never disliked me exactly, fully accepted that Daniel had built. She'd raised him alone after his father left when Daniel was 8. She decided that the two of them were a package deal. She had opinions about our wedding venue, the fact that we didn't come to her house every single Sunday, the way people do with a parent they love but have learned not to argue with, the same tired shorthand every son of a difficult mother eventually adopts, a real opportunity. More money, she told him, more than once, know why he'd let his wife talk, away from the people who actually loved him. Because arguing with Patricia was like arguing with weather. I opened my mailbox and found an envelope from the county family court, filed by my mother-in-law, supported by a psychiatric evaluation stating, untreated depressive, providing a safe environment. I had never met the doctor who signed that evaluation. This is the story of how I almost lost my son to a woman I used to call family. My name is Sarah Mitchell. 4 months before that envelope arrived, fall at a construction site he was supervising, technically investigating. We'd been married 7 years. Who was 5 at the time all of this happened? The best thing either of us ever did. Both from small towns about 3 hours apart. Ordinary way. Apartment. Wedding, first house. His mother, Patricia, was part of that life the entire time, technically. I've had a lot of time to think about since. It was more that she never, a life that wasn't centered around her. And I think somewhere in there, that anyone who married him was really just marrying into being managed by her. Our first apartment, the school district we picked for Ethan, Daniel used to just absorb it. And that's just Mom, he'd say. When Daniel and I moved 2 hours away for his job 4 years ago, better schools, Patricia took it almost as a personal betrayal, in front of me that she didn't, him into moving his whole family. I let that one go mostly. It didn't change anything, and it exhausted everyone involved. Daniel died on a Thursday. I remember it in fragments. A phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A supervisor's voice trying to be gentle and failing. The drive to the hospital where I don't actually remember driving at all. Ethan was at kindergarten. I had to pick him up that afternoon and figure out, in the space of about 90 minutes, how to tell a 5-year-old that his dad wasn't coming home. I don't think I've ever done anything harder in my life, before or since, and that includes everything that came after. Patricia arrived the next morning, and for the first few weeks, I was genuinely grateful for her. She helped with the funeral arrangements, cooked more food than we could ever eat, took Ethan to the park so I could have an hour alone in the shower without an audience for once. Grief does strange things to how you see people. For a while, I actually thought maybe this was the moment that finally brought us closer. I was wrong. I just didn't know it yet. Around the 6-week mark, small comments started slipping in. Patricia would visit and mention, almost offhand, that Ethan seemed quieter than usual, or that she'd noticed I was still in my pajamas at 2 p.m, which is understandable, of course. Grief takes time. At first I read these as concern. Looking back, I think she was building a file in her head, one comment at a time, long before she ever put anything on paper. She started offering to take Ethan for overnights, so you can rest, which I appreciated, genuinely, because grief with a 5-year-old in the house doesn't leave much room to fall apart even when you desperately need to. What I didn't realize was that every one of those overnights was also an opportunity. She'd ask Ethan leading questions. Does Mommy cry a lot at night? Does Mommy forget to make you breakfast sometimes? The kind of thing a 5-year-old answers honestly and without any understanding of how those honest little answers might get used later. I found this out from Ethan himself months later, in the offhand way kids reveal things, saying something like, "Grandma asks me if you're sad a lot." At the time, it didn't alarm me. I just told him it was okay to tell the truth, that I was sad sometimes because I missed Daddy, and that being sad didn't mean anything was wrong with our family. I had no idea I was handing her exactly the kind of quote she wanted. About 10 weeks after Daniel died, at my own doctor's suggestion, I started seeing a grief counselor, a woman named Dr. Angela Weiss, once a week. It helped. It genuinely, meaningfully helped in the unglamorous way therapy actually works. Not some dramatic breakthrough, just a slow return to being able to function like a person again. I mentioned this to Patricia at one point, thinking it might reassure her that I was taking care of myself. Her reaction was strange in hindsight. A little too interested. A little too many follow-up questions about how often I went, what we talked about, whether I'd been prescribed anything. I didn't think much of it then. I think about it constantly now, because I believe that conversation is exactly where the idea took root. Real therapy, taken and twisted, becomes a much more convincing lie than something invented from nothing. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in July, 5 months after Daniel's death. I remember standing at my own mailbox in my driveway, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, opening what I assumed was a bill, and instead finding a court document with my name and my son's name on it, filed by Patricia Mitchell, requesting emergency temporary guardianship, on the grounds that I was mentally unfit to care for him. Attached was a psychiatric evaluation, 3 pages long, on official-looking letterhead from something called Ridgemont Behavioral Associates, signed by a Dr. Howard Reeves, licensed clinical psychologist. It described, in clinical detached language, a woman experiencing severe untreated major depressive disorder, exhibiting neglect of basic parental duties, expressing to her therapist persistent feelings of hopelessness regarding her ability to parent. I had never heard of Dr. Howard Reeves. I had never been evaluated by anyone. Other than Dr. Weiss, I stood in my driveway reading a supposedly professional document describing a version of my mental state that simply did not exist, attached to a legal filing asking a judge to remove my son from my home on an emergency basis within 72 hours. I want you to imagine that feeling for a second, not the fear of losing your child, though that was there, immediate and physical, like the ground genuinely moving under me. I mean the specific disorientation of reading a professional evaluation of yourself, written with total clinical confidence, describing someone who is not you, and realizing that a judge might read this exact document in a few days and believe it completely. If you've ever had someone weaponize your grief against you, hit that like button before we keep going, because what Sarah found out about Dr. Howard Reeves is the moment this story turns. I called my brother Mark, who is a corporate attorney, not a family law specialist, but he knew enough to tell me exactly 2 things immediately. First, hire a family law attorney today, not next week. Second, before anything else, verify that the doctor on that evaluation was real, because something about the whole thing smelled wrong to him from the first read. It took less than 15 minutes on the state. Licensing boards. Public website to find out that no psychologist named Howard Reeves had ever been licensed in this state. Not lapsed, not revoked, never existed in their system at all. Ridgemont Behavioral Associates, the practice listed on the letterhead, had no registered business filing anywhere in the county. The address on the letterhead, when I looked it up, belonged to a mailbox rental store 2 towns over. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, Ethan asleep upstairs, and just stared at the screen for a long time. Somewhere in the last 2 months, someone had built an entire fictional psychologist, complete with letterhead and a plausible clinical writing style, specifically to convince a judge that I was unfit to raise my own child. The obvious question was who? The slightly less obvious, more painful question was how someone who'd been at my son's 5th birthday party 3 months earlier had decided this was a reasonable thing to do. I found a family law attorney named Renata Cole through a recommendation from Dr. Weiss, my actual therapist, who was, understandably, alarmed to learn her name in our real sessions had apparently been referenced, vaguely, secondhand, through Ethan's overheard comments to Patricia, as supporting evidence for a diagnosis she had never made and would never have made, because nothing in our actual sessions remotely resembled what that fake evaluation described. Renata was calm in a way I badly needed someone to be calm, because I was not. She explained that emergency guardianship petitions, especially ones built on fabricated medical evidence, don't hold up well once exposed, but exposing them properly, in a way a judge would find credible, meant building an airtight case rather than just showing up and saying, "This doctor doesn't exist," even though that alone felt like it should have been enough. We requested Dr. Weiss provide a sworn statement, confirming the real content and frequency of our actual sessions, directly contradicting the fabricated evaluation. We subpoenaed records for Ridgemont Behavioral Associates, which predictably came back empty, because the practice had never filed so much as a single tax document, business license, or insurance registration anywhere. And then Renata asked me a question that changed the direction of everything. Had anyone had unsupervised access to my house in the last few months? Because whoever built this case seemed to know oddly specific, private details about my daily routine, not just general impressions, but specific timestamps, specific rooms, specific habits. That's when I remembered the baby monitor. When Daniel died, Patricia had insisted on installing what she called a helper camera in our living room, technically a modernized version of an old baby monitor but Wi-Fi enabled, marketed for keeping an eye on toddlers from another room. She'd framed it as a gift, something to help me keep an eye on Ethan during the hardest weeks. Back when I could barely function some mornings, I'd said yes without thinking much about it, because at the time, someone else thinking through logistics for me felt like relief, not a threat. I never once considered that she had the login credentials to that camera's companion app on her own phone, because she was the one who'd set the whole thing up in my kitchen. On a day, I was in no condition to double-check exactly what she'd created an account for. Renata had our IT-savvy paralegal pull the camera's activity logs, which, because the device stored cloud footage for 90 days by default, still had a usable history. The logs showed regular remote viewing sessions from a device registered to Patricia's email address at all hours, for months, including several occasions where the footage had clearly been exported and downloaded, not just viewed live. We couldn't get the exact exported clips back from the company's servers, since Patricia had deleted her local copies. But the metadata alone, regular, sustained remote access to a camera inside my private living room for months, without my knowledge or renewed consent, was damning on its own. Combined with a fabricated medical evaluation and a fictional doctor, a picture was forming that had nothing to do with genuine concern for Ethan's well-being. There was one more piece. The fake evaluation had been notarized, stamped and signed by a notary public named Linda Park, whose seal was, unlike Dr. Reeves, entirely real and traceable. Renata subpoenaed Linda Park's notary log, the record every notary is legally required to keep of documents they've certified. Linda Park turned out to be an old family friend of Patricia's, someone she'd known for over 20 years through their church. Under subpoena, faced with the possibility of losing her notary commission and facing her own fraud exposure, Linda admitted, reluctantly, in a signed statement, that Patricia had asked her, as a favor between old friends, to notarize a document Patricia herself had drafted and printed, explaining only that it was for a family legal matter, and that she didn't need to actually read the whole thing carefully. Linda hadn't known, she claimed, that she was certifying a fabricated psychiatric evaluation designed to take a child from his mother. Whether that's entirely true or a convenient thing to say once caught, I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that her signature, on official state notary paperwork, put a very real, very traceable name directly next to Patricia's fabricated one. By the time the emergency hearing date arrived, 6 weeks after that envelope first showed up in my mailbox, Renata and I had assembled a case that went far beyond simply disputing Patricia's claims. We had a sworn statement from my actual therapist. We had licensing board confirmation that Dr. Howard Reeves had never existed as a credentialed psychologist in this state. We had camera access logs showing months of unauthorized remote surveillance of my home. We had a notary's signed admission that she'd certified a document without verifying its content at Patricia's specific request. Those 6 weeks were, without exaggeration, some of the hardest of my life. Harder in some ways than the immediate weeks after. Daniel died because grief, at least, doesn't come with a legal deadline attached to it. I went to work. I picked Ethan up from school. I made dinner, gave baths, read bedtime stories, and then sat at my kitchen table most nights until midnight going through Discovery, documents with Renata over video calls, trying to hold two completely different versions of my life, together at once, the ordinary one, for Ethan's sake, and the one where I was quietly terrified I might lose him. I made the decision, with Renata's and Dr. Weiss's input, not to tell Ethan directly about the court case. He knew in the vague way 5-year-olds absorb tension that something serious was happening involving Grandma. And he asked me once, very directly, in the bath, "Are you and Grandma fighting because of me?" I told him no, that grown-ups sometimes disagree about grown-up things, and that none of it was his fault, and that nothing was going to change about how much I loved him or how much time we got to spend together. I don't know if that was entirely honest, given how genuinely uncertain the outcome felt some weeks, but I think it was the right thing to say to a 5-year-old regardless. The hearing took place over 2 days in family court, in front of a judge named Judge Alvarez, a woman who had clearly seen a wide range of families at their worst, and had developed a very particular, very unimpressed way of listening that gave away almost nothing about which way she was leaning. Patricia's attorney presented first. He walked through the fabricated evaluation, as though it were unquestionably legitimate, reading portions aloud, describing my supposed persistent hopelessness and diminished capacity for consistent childcare, and supplemented it with testimony from Patricia herself, describing specific incidents she claimed to have witnessed personally, Ethan seeming withdrawn, me being, in her words, distant and unfocused during pickups. At times she said she'd found the house in disarray with dishes piled up, framing ordinary grief-era exhaustion as evidence of incapacity. I sat there listening to a version of myself I didn't fully recognize, constructed out of half-true fragments and outright fabrications, presented with total confidence to a judge who, as far as I could tell from her expression, was taking every word seriously. It's a specific, sick kind of powerlessness, sitting silently while someone builds a legal case against your character using selectively edited versions of your worst days. If you've ever sat somewhere and had to stay quiet while someone lied about you to people who had power over your life, tell me about it in the comments. I want to know how you got through it. Day 2 belonged to Renata, and I will be honest with you. I have never in my life watched anyone dismantle a case as methodically as she did that morning. She began with the state licensing board records, entered as certified documents, showing definitively that no psychologist named Howard Reeves had ever held a license in this state, in any capacity, at any point in the board's digital records going back over 3 decades. Patricia's attorney tried to argue the license might exist under a different name or in a different state. Renata had already anticipated that and produced a national licensing database search covering all 50 states, coming back completely empty as well. Then came Dr. Weiss's sworn statement describing our actual therapy sessions, grief processing, healthy coping strategies, normal parenting stress, nothing remotely resembling the fabricated diagnosis attached to the petition. Dr. Weiss noted, pointedly in her statement, that she had never heard of Dr. Howard Reeves, had never referred me to any additional evaluation, and considered the attached document a direct misrepresentation of both her professional opinion and mine. Then the camera logs. Renata walked the court through months of remote access sessions to a camera inside my private home, all traced to a device registered under Patricia's email, including several data exports, time-stamped in the days immediately before the fabricated evaluation's stated date, strongly suggesting the footage had been reviewed specifically to mine for material. And finally, Linda Park's signed statement, admitting she had notarized a document without reading its contents, at Patricia's specific request, describing their decades-long friendship and her reluctant realization, after being served with a subpoena of what she may have actually certified. By the end of it, Patricia's attorney asked for a brief recess. I don't know exactly what was said between them during that break, but when they returned, his tone had changed considerably. Less certainty, more careful hedging about his client's genuine concern for her grandson's well-being, which is, I'll admit, the one part of this whole mess I do actually believe was real. Twisted as her methods were, Judge Alvarez did not take long to rule. She stated plainly that the petition before her relied on a fabricated medical document submitted by a family member with unauthorized, sustained access to the mother's private residence, notarized through what appeared to be a favor extended without proper verification. She dismissed the guardianship petition entirely, denied all requested relief, and on this part surprised even Renata referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of possible fraud and forgery charges related to the fabricated evaluation. Judge Alvarez did not take long to rule. She stated plainly that the petition before her relied on a fabricated medical document submitted by a family member with unauthorized, sustained access to the mother's private residence, notarized through what appeared to be a favor extended without proper verification. She dismissed the guardianship petition entirely, denied all requested relief, and on this part surprised even Renata referred the matter to the district attorney's office for review of possible fraud and forgery charges related to the fabricated evaluation. She also, at Renata's request, issued a formal order significantly restricting Patricia's access to Ethan, limited to supervised visits only, pending a full review. Given what the court had just heard about months of covert surveillance inside my home, I remember standing in the courthouse hallway afterward, Renata beside me feeling less like victory, and more like someone had finally let me put down something impossibly heavy that I'd been carrying silently for 6 weeks. Patricia was formally charged the following month with forgery and filing a fraudulent court document because no prior criminal record existed, and the guardianship petition had ultimately been dismissed before causing permanent harm. Her sentencing outcome ended up being probation and a fine rather than incarceration, along with the ongoing family court restrictions Judge Alvarez had already put in place. Linda Park, the notary, lost her commission entirely and is currently facing her own separate inquiry regarding professional negligence. I won't pretend the last part of this story is simple. Patricia is still Ethan's grandmother, still Daniel's mother, and some distant day. If there's ever real accountability and real change on her end, I'm not entirely closed off to the idea of a relationship existing again in some limited form, for Ethan's sake if nothing else. Right now, though, we are exactly where the court order has us. Supervised, distant, and frankly, exactly as far apart as I need us to be. Ethan is 6 now. He still asks about Grandma sometimes, and I answer honestly, in 5-year-old appropriate language, that grown-ups sometimes make choices that hurt other people, and that sometimes love and trust have to be earned back slowly, if they can be earned back at all. I think that's a more honest lesson than pretending everything is fine, and it's one I hope he carries with him longer than he'll ever remember the details of a courtroom he was thankfully too young to sit inside. Some nights after he's asleep, I still think about that afternoon at my mailbox, holding a professional document describing a stranger wearing my name, and how close 6 weeks came to changing both of our lives permanently over a doctor who never existed. So tell me, was I wrong to push for the fraud charges instead of just letting the dismissal be enough and moving on quietly? Would you have handled Patricia differently, given she's still your child's grandmother? Let me know in the comments. And if you stayed with this story until the very end, make sure you're subscribed, because grief brings out the truth in people, one way or another, and this channel exists to tell you what happens next.